Hey kids, it's time we had a talk about LBX autocannons. These are some of the most effective ballistic weapons in BattleTech, but there are definitely some complications and some difficult decisions that come up when you decide to use them. Just to refresh all of our memory on the basics, like regular autocannons, the LBXs come in size 2, 5, 10, and 20, and they have two modes. This is where a lot of the difficulty comes in. They have a cluster mode where they shoot little pellets. Every point of damage that the autocannon does when you use cluster mode hits as a separate hit location, and in that mode they have a -1 to hit bonus. Then they have a regular mode, which is just like a regular autocannon, a solid blast of damage, for example 10 points if you're firing an LB-10X. So the tough decision with these things is always, when do you use the cluster ammunition versus when do you use the regular ammunition? And this is something where I've seen some really experienced and good players kind of disagree with each other and have some different opinions, and sometimes some opinions that have surprised me. So I decided this was a good occasion for me to just kind of take a deep dive on it and figure out what I think. Go to it with an open mind rather than assuming that the assumptions that I brought in previously have been correct. Now, there are some things about LBXs that I take myself to know pretty much for certain, and I'm going to consider these some ironclad rules. So first, let me lay out 3 rules that I think don't really have any interesting exceptions in BattleTech. You always want to follow these rules. The first one is always use the cluster ammunition when you're firing an LB-2X or an LB-5X. There might be edge cases where you would want to use a higher, the higher damage from the solid shot, but honestly those are going to be such edge cases that there's not really any point in carrying standard solid shot autocannon ammo on an LB-2X or an LB-5X. There's not that much advantage in doing 5 damage to a location compared with 1 damage to that location in the situations where you'll be using these autocannons, so just go with the cluster. Second, against VTOLs, against helicopters for example, cluster gives you some really amazing bonuses because you get to use the flak ammunition rules, so you're getting a total of -3 to hit. And plus, cluster is really good against VTOLs because you have so many chances of, on the one hand, doing crits, and on the other hand, getting rotor hits, which are really damaging. They'll reduce the movement of the VTOL. So always use cluster when firing at VTOLs, no exceptions. And finally, this is a super edge case. This is a thing that doesn't come up very often unless you play in really late eras against a lot of clan units. But if you're playing against somebody who has ferrolamellar armor, remember that that will reduce the damage of the single point LB-10X pellets or LBX pellets for any LBX autocannon. It'll reduce that damage to 0. So you do always want to use solid shot against that ferrolamellar armor. Again, not something that comes up that often, but against the mechs where it does come up, you definitely want to keep it in mind. Now, I also think there are some general rules that may have a few exceptions, and maybe I'll talk about what some of those might be, but in general, right, these rules are really good ones to follow 95–99% of the time. Okay, the first one of these is, as a lot of people know, as I hope you know already, LBX autocannons are extremely good against armored vehicles because the best thing against armored vehicles is to crit them out, to hit them, give them motive hits, immobilize them. So anytime you're fighting against an armored vehicle that isn't already immobilized, you basically want to use cluster fire against it because that gives you so many extra chances of rolling a motive hit that might reduce the movement points of the tank. Okay, so pretty much always against an armored vehicle that hasn't already been immobilized, you want to use the cluster ammunition. Additionally, if you look at the ground vehicle hit table, you will see that the side shot arc, if they're getting hit from the side, which is a pretty large arc, remember, for a vehicle, if you get hit in the side, you have this extra chance of getting critted on a number 8. So that's almost like a 20-something, I think it's almost a 30% chance of getting critted if you're hit on the side. And those crits can be quite devastating. A lot of the time they will stun the tank crew, which is usually means doom for the tank because it makes it extremely vulnerable. So if you're firing into a side arc of a tank, you pretty much always want to use cluster ammunition. That's pretty much a guarantee. This is true even if the vehicle has already been immobilized, because honestly, it's often quicker to destroy these vehicles by critting them out instead of by doing damage directly to that side. I mean, maybe if they're in a situation where their armor plus structure is less than the total damage of the solid shot and you have a really easy shot against them, maybe in that kind of situation you should use a solid shot, but you'll never be making a big mistake by using cluster against a side arc of an armored vehicle. The only time when it would be a mistake is if you are playing with the vehicle effectiveness optional rule, which takes away that extra chance to get critted from the side arc. So if you're playing with that rule, then this general rule of LBX tactics doesn't apply. Now, another general rule that's extremely reliable to use, 99% of the time this is right, is you want to use cluster shots against any battle mech that has at least one location with 0 armor pierced, okay? So maybe you stripped off that armor with a Gauss rifle or LRMs or an AC-20 or whatever. The armor is gone on that location and it mounts mission critical components, right? So if it's a left arm that doesn't carry a weapon and all it's got is, you know, actuators that are only good for punching, don't use cluster to try to crit out that arm. But if the arm has like a big old PPC in it, or especially if you have a bare torso containing engine locations, a bare center torso especially, you want to use cluster to try and inflict critical hits. In this kind of a situation, by the way, a thing you want to be careful to always do is fire the LB-10X or whatever LBX autocannon you're using after you have fired all your other weapons, because that way the other weapons have more of a chance to pierce locations before the cluster hits the mech, okay? So always fire your cluster LBX autocannons at the end of your list of weapons. All right, now my final general rule, and this is the one that probably has the most exceptions. This is more of like a 95% thing instead of a 99% thing. But if you have a mech where its armor hasn't been pierced and solid shot would pierce an important location, okay, like maybe it only has 9 or 10 armor on a side torso with an XL engine in it, and you're using an LB-10X autocannon, so 10 damage would pierce the armor and maybe even inflict an internal hit, but you know, as long as it would pierce the armor, you want to use solid shot in that situation, okay? Because the solid shot gives you a chance to directly pierce armor and maybe inflict a crit. And by the way, I'm not counting the head here, okay? Because head hits are so rare that you can't count on even a strong possibility of them. So don't fire solid shot just because you have an LB-10X and there's only 9 armor on the head, okay? Most of the time, you're just not gonna hit that head. All right, now the tough question, the question that I think is really difficult to answer, is when do you use cluster versus solid shot ammunition against a mech that has fully intact armor where you're not going to pierce the armor with a single solid shot? This is a place where we got to do some math, okay? So when you are firing cluster ammunition at a mech with intact armor, what you're really doing is fishing for critical hits and head hits. The thing that would make that cluster shot worthwhile is if you were to ding the mech in the head and do some pilot damage, which can accumulate over the course of the game and be really bad. Or if you were to do a through armor crit that would do a crit to something like, oh boy, especially a gyro or a cockpit or something like that, or even like an engine hit or an important weapon, those would be the things that would make your cluster shot worthwhile. If you're just doing damage with the cluster shot and you're not inflicting any crits or head hits, it's pretty close to being a wasted shot, okay? Because you're just doing one little point of damage to a bunch of different locations, sandblasting the target. You're not really wearing down the armor in any one location to pierce it. So you're really not making progress towards exposing the vulnerable spots on this mech if you just hit with cluster and you don't get any crits or head hits. So it's really important to the question of making those cluster shots. How likely are head hits and how likely are through armor crits? Okay, so head hits and through armor crits, it's a 2 or a 12, so you've got a 1 in 36 chance for each of those, right? So we'll put that at the start. Now the through armor crits, it's a little more complicated though, because you then need to roll an 8 or above, okay? So that makes only a 1.15% chance that you'll roll a 2 for a through armor crit and then an 8 or above to confirm the crit, okay? Now, also, if you're using the floating crits rule where the crits can show up anywhere on the mech, which is a very common rule, most players play with this rule. If you're using that rule, there's always the chance that you'll hit a left arm with useless actuators, or you'll hit a heatsink or something like that. You can always hit a heatsink. You know, double heatsinks are big, they take up a lot of space. You might hit something that's a crit pad that's not doing any work for the mech, okay? So on a typical mech, I would say, it may turn out that maybe half of floating crits don't have a big impact on the game. Maybe they're hitting a small laser, like a weapon that the mech doesn't really need. You know, it kind of benefits from a little bit, but it's not that important. Sometimes you hit ammunition and then, wow, that's great. But I would say a lot of the time, about half of the floating crits that you might do are not very impactful. Okay, so you're looking at about half of that 1.15% chance of doing something really impactful on the game with your through armor crit. So we add these things up and I would say you end up with about a 3.4% probability for each pellet that pellet will be a beneficial hit. Now on average an LB-10X will hit with 6 pellets. So I put down here the calculation, what's the probability that any given LB-10X cluster shot will give you a beneficial hit if it hits. And it turns out it's only about 19% probability of a head hit or a good crit if you hit with an LB-10X against a mech that hasn't had its armor pierced. So this isn't really the world's greatest, right? 4 out of the 5 times that you fire LB-10X cluster at a mech, you're not going to do a special head hit or a worthwhile crit. Now, you could go for 4 or 5 turns doing that and you don't do anything. You're not making any progress towards winning the game. You would have been way better off firing solid shot. The times that you'll inflict a hit, I mean, it can be really good, but like a single head hit isn't exactly a game winner either. You know, a single ammo hit can be a game winner, but how often is that going to be the thing that you get? I feel like a lot of players mentally exaggerate because they've had a couple of events in their life where they hit ammunition with an LB-10X pellet and they're like, oh my god, firing cluster is the best thing in the world because it can just take out a mech. But a lot of the time that's super unlikely. Now there's some other factors that we should take into consideration when we're talking about firing cluster versus regular with an LB-10X or an LB-20X. Okay, one factor is, as I mentioned, right, if you're firing the solid shot, you're making progress towards piercing the enemy mech's armor, especially if you're also firing other weapons that do significant damage chunks. Like if you're firing an LB-10X together with a PPC, now you're doing 2 10-point chunks. That's a lot of chances potentially to pierce armor. Also, if you're firing an LB-10X together with a PPC, well, you might cause a pilot skill roll if you hit with solid shot LB-10X plus a PPC, whereas your odds of causing a PSR if you're firing cluster LB-10X are really low, since the odds of hitting with all 10 points of damage are really low. On the other hand, we must always keep in mind that -1 to hit bonus from the cluster ammunition. That's pretty good. You know, 1 point better to hit can make a huge difference in BattleTech. Okay, so let's take stock. Where do I end up after bringing all of these factors into consideration? I end up with the following rules, I would say, and some of this is guesswork. But what do I do when I'm firing, for example, an LB-10X, which is the most common LBX autocannon a lot of the time, especially in the inner sphere side? Well, if my 2-hit number starts out at a 10 or worse, So then it would be a 9 if I'm firing the cluster. I'm going to be inclined to fire cluster. So especially a lot of the time, the first turn of shooting in the game, you're far enough away, your 2-hit numbers are not very good. It might be an 11 or a 10 if you fire solid shot, and a 9 or a 10 if you fire cluster. In that kind of a situation, that 2-hit bonus, it's worth it, right? Because if you miss, you don't do anything. If you hit, you at least have a chance of doing something. You've got that 20% chance of inflicting a bad crit or a head hit. Otherwise, though, if I've got better numbers than that, if I would hit on a 9 or better if I use solid shot, then I would say if I'm firing against a mech with intact armor, I would tend to want to use solid shot if I have better than a 9 to hit, all right? Especially if I'm pairing this weapon with other big chunk of damage weapons like a PPC, so that increases my chance of piercing armor and inflicting a pilot skill roll on my opponent. I think it's probably, if I had to guess, I don't have rigorous math to back this up because it would be super complicated, I think, but it seems to me that using solid shot is better when you add in those chances of causing a pilot roll and when you add in those chances of piercing armor. I want to emphasize, though, I hope that I've hedged what I've said strongly enough. I am not certain that this is the right way to think about this. I think there's a good chance that maybe I have discounted too much some of the possible, very high benefits of really doing things like getting ammo hits with those LB-10Xs, especially maybe against assault mechs. I know a lot of players like to shotgun assault mechs with LBX autocannons to cause pilot hits and stuff like that. I can see how that might be a better strategy than I'm thinking of it as being, but I have to say, on the basis of those probability considerations that I put up on the previous slide, it just seems like it's not super likely to succeed most of the time to me. So that's what I have for you about LB-10X and LBX in general, autocannon tactics. And please weigh in the comments because, like I said on the end of the last slide, I'm really not very certain of the stuff that I'm saying here. I hope that I've brought forward some kind of useful considerations that will help you in your decisions about when to use your LBX autocannons with cluster versus regular, but please give me your input because I'm very open to changing my mind about some of this stuff.